Snow fell from the dark sky like tiny white feathers, covering the silent forest in cold light. Every sound was swallowed by the wind. The trees stood like tall ghosts, their branches heavy with ice. The world looked peaceful, but to Arya it was a place of danger. She had been walking for hours through the storm, her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. Her hands trembled as she held her torn cloak close to her chest, trying to keep the little warmth she still had. Arya's steps were slow and heavy. Her boots were thin and old, soaked with melted snow. Her feet ached and her fingers were numb. She looked around for any sign of shelter, but all she saw was white. White trees, white ground, white sky. She whispered to herself, "Just one night. Please let me survive one more night." She found an old wooden cabin near the edge of the forest. The roof was half broken and one wall leaned dangerously to the side. But to her it was better than freezing outside. She pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, and stepped inside. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. The air smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. Still, it was shelter. Arya closed the door behind her and sat down on the floor, curling her knees to her chest. Her body shook from the cold. She had lived through many winters, but never one like this. This time she was truly alone. The storm outside howled like a hungry beast. She could hear the wind crying through the cracks in the wall. She touched the pendant around her neck, a small silver charm shaped like a star. It was the only thing she had left from her mother. When Arya was a child, her mother had told her, "This star will remind you that even in the darkest night there is always a little light." Arya closed her eyes and held the pendant tightly. "Mother," she whispered, "I wish you were here." She stood up and began to look around the cabin. There was an old fireplace at one corner, filled with ashes and broken wood. Maybe she could make a fire. She searched for anything she could burn. Dry pieces of furniture, bits of wood from the broken roof, anything. After gathering what she could, she used 2 small stones to spark a flame. It took her many tries and her hands hurt from the effort, but at last a weak flame flickered to life. The fire was small and tired, just like her. She placed her hands close to it, trying to feel the heat. It wasn't much, but it was something. The light from the flame danced on the walls, casting long, trembling shadows. For a moment, it almost felt like company. Arya's face was pale. She hadn't eaten for 2 days. The cold had taken away her hunger, leaving only a heavy emptiness inside her. She leaned her head against the wall and listened to the wind outside. It was strange. Sometimes she thought she could hear voices in it. Whispers of her past. She could almost hear her father's laugh, her mother's song, and the sounds of her old home before everything was lost. She wasn't fully human, not anymore. Her kind had once lived beside humans long ago, before fear tore them apart. Half human, half something else, she was seen as strange, unwanted. Her people had been hunted, driven away, forgotten. She was the last of her family, wandering from place to place, always hiding, always cold. She remembered the last time she had seen another person. It had been weeks ago, in a small village far from the mountains. She had gone there to trade herbs for bread. But when the villagers saw her pointed ears and the faint glow in her eyes, they had called her names: monster, witch, cursed one. A child had thrown a stone at her. A man had shouted, "Leave before we burn you out," and so she had left. Since that day, she hadn't spoken to anyone. Now she was here, in a broken cabin surrounded by endless snow. The night was long and cruel. The fire began to die again. She looked around and realized there wasn't enough wood to keep it alive until morning. Panic started to rise in her chest. Without the fire, she would freeze. She got up quickly, searching every corner of the room, but there was nothing left to burn. Her eyes fell on her own cloak, thin, torn, but still warm. She hesitated. It was her last protection against the cold, yet without fire it would not matter. Her hands shook as she held the edge of the cloak near the flame. The smell of burning cloth filled the air. The fire flared up, brighter now, but she could feel her heart break a little. That cloak had been made by her mother years ago. Now it was gone, turned to ash. Tears filled her eyes, but they froze before they could fall. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Mother. I didn't have a choice." The light warmed her face, and for a short moment it felt like a gentle hand touching her cheek. Hours passed. The night grew colder and the fire grew smaller. Arya sat close to it, rubbing her hands together, whispering small songs her mother once sang. She tried to keep her mind busy, to forget how hungry and tired she was. Outside, the snow kept falling. The wind screamed, shaking the cabin walls. Each time the wind pushed against the wood, she thought the roof would collapse. She thought of the stars hidden behind the storm. Once, when she was little, she used to believe that stars could hear her wishes. Maybe, she whispered to herself, they still can. She closed her eyes tightly and made a wish, not for food or warmth, but for someone to find her. Someone who would see her not as a monster, but as a person. Please, she said softly, let me not be alone forever. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence, the sound of wood snapping. The cabin shook as part of the roof gave way. Snow fell inside, covering the small fire. Arya gasped and jumped back. The flame died instantly, leaving only smoke and darkness. Panic filled her chest. Without the fire, the cold rushed in like a wave. She tried to relight it, her fingers trembling too much to hold the stones. Please, please, she whispered, striking them again and again. But no spark came. Her hands were too stiff, too weak. The darkness pressed closer. Her breath came out in short, painful bursts. She crawled closer to the ashes, trying to catch any leftover warmth, but there was none. Her body began to shake uncontrollably. She could feel the frost creeping up her legs, biting her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth. Don't sleep, she told herself. If you sleep, you won't wake up. She tried to stay awake, tried to think of anything other than the cold. She remembered summer, green fields, soft wind, her mother's voice. She held on to those memories like a fragile flame in her mind. Time lost its meaning. The night stretched endlessly. She could no longer feel her fingers. Her eyelids grew heavy. The sound of the storm became softer, almost like a lullaby. She forced her eyes open, whispering, "Not yet, not yet." But her voice was weak, almost gone. And then, something strange happened. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, a faint light appeared. Not firelight, but moonlight. The clouds above had shifted for a moment, letting the full moon shine through. The silver light fell on her face, and for a brief moment it seemed warm. Arya looked up at it, her lips trembling into a small smile. "The stars heard me," she whispered. She gathered her remaining strength and crawled toward the broken window. Outside, the world was bright with moonlight. The snow sparkled like diamonds. It was beautiful in a cruel way. She placed her hand on the window frame, feeling the cold wood beneath her palm. "One night," she said softly. "I can survive one night." With that, she returned to her corner and wrapped herself as tightly as she could in the remaining cloth. Her body hurt. Her breath was shallow, but somewhere inside her heart a small spark of hope remained. Even if everything around her was frozen, that spark refused to die. The night went on, long and silent. The snow outside kept falling, but in her mind she could still see the moonlight. She whispered one last prayer before closing her eyes. "Let the morning come. Let there still be light." The storm answered with a low rumble, as if the world itself was listening. And in that lonely, freezing cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, Arya's first night of survival began. The morning came slowly, with a pale gray light spreading across the snowy forest. Arya's eyes opened weakly. Her body ached, and her breath came out in short, trembling gasps. The fire had long died. Her lips were dry and cracked, and her fingers were stiff and white. She tried to move, but every small motion sent pain through her limbs. Still, she forced herself to sit up. The cabin was colder than before. The broken roof had let snow fall in during the night, covering the floor in a thin white layer. Her cloak was gone, burned away. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Arya rubbed her arms, trying to bring some feeling back, but it was useless. Her body felt heavy, and her head spun. "Morning," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and weak. "I made it." She looked around the cabin. Everything was quiet. The world outside was still and silent, almost too still. The storm had stopped for now, but the sky was a dull, cloudy gray. There was no sign of birds, no sound of water, no movement at all, only silence. It was as if the world itself had gone to sleep. Arya knew she needed to find food. Her stomach twisted painfully. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, and the hunger made her dizzy. She stood up slowly, using the wall for support. Her legs shook, but she pushed herself toward the door. When she opened it, a rush of freezing wind hit her face, stealing her breath away. Still, she stepped outside. The snow reached almost to her knees. Each step was hard, slow, and painful. The forest was covered in white, the trees heavy with ice. Her eyes scanned the ground for anything, berries, roots, or even animal tracks, but there was nothing. Everything was hidden under the snow. As she walked, her thoughts wandered. She remembered her father's voice teaching her how to hunt and survive in the wild. He had always told her, "The forest gives if you respect it." But now the forest gave nothing, only silence, only cold. Hours passed as she wandered, but she found nothing. Her energy was fading fast. She sank down beside a tree, her chest heaving. "I can't give up," she whispered, but her voice sounded uncertain. Her body was so weak that she could barely keep her eyes open. She looked at her trembling hands. They no longer felt like her own. They were pale, stiff, almost blue. She tried to rub them together, but it didn't help. She needed fire again, but she had nothing left to burn. Her cloak was gone. The cabin had no more wood. Even her boots were wet and frozen solid. She looked down at them and thought about taking them off to dry, but she knew it would only make things worse. The cold was already creeping into her bones. A sound suddenly broke the silence. It was faint, like the crack of a branch far away. Arya lifted her head quickly. Her heart raced. "Someone?" she called weakly, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. No answer. She listened harder. The sound came again, this time closer. A small flicker of hope lit inside her chest. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. "Hello?" she called again. "Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed between the trees. Still nothing. Then, from behind a cluster of snow-covered bushes, a small animal appeared, a white hare. Its fur blended perfectly with the snow. It stopped and looked at her, its black eyes wide and cautious. Arya let out a weak laugh of relief. "You scared me," she whispered softly. The hare tilted its head, sniffing the air. For a moment she thought of catching it. It could save her life. But when she looked at its small body trembling in the cold, she couldn't. "No," she said quietly. "You deserve to live too." The hare twitched its ears and then hopped away into the forest. She watched it disappear, feeling strangely comforted. At least she wasn't the only living thing left. But comfort did not fill her stomach. She needed to get back before the light faded. She forced herself to walk, step by slow step, back toward the broken cabin. By the time she returned, the sky had started to darken again. The second night was coming, and she was not ready. Inside, the cabin was just as cold as before. The air felt heavier, as if the night itself had weight. Arya sank to the ground, exhausted. Her hands trembled as she tried to start another fire with the few pieces of broken wood she had found outside. After several painful minutes, a small flame appeared, but it was weak. It danced uncertainly, fighting against the cold air. Arya watched the little flame with desperate eyes. "Please don't die," she whispered. She fed it small bits of wood until the fire grew a little stronger. The light painted her tired face in shades of gold and shadow. She stretched her hands toward it, sighing softly as the warmth returned for a short while. Her stomach growled loudly. She pressed her hand against it, trying to ignore the hunger. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "I'll find something tomorrow." But deep down, she didn't believe it. She was running out of strength, and the forest was running out of mercy. The hours passed slowly. The night outside grew darker and colder. The wind returned, howling around the cabin like a hungry spirit. The wood she had collected was almost gone. Arya looked around desperately for anything else to burn. Her eyes landed on a small wooden stool near the corner of the room. Without hesitation, she broke it apart and fed the pieces to the fire. The flames rose higher again, filling the room with flickering light. For a brief moment, she felt a tiny spark of triumph. "There," she whispered. "That should last for a while." But she knew it wouldn't last until morning. As she watched the fire, her thoughts drifted again. She remembered laughter, the sound of children playing, of her mother singing while cooking over a warm hearth. She remembered her father's strong hands fixing a roof in the rain. Those days had felt endless back then. Now they felt like a dream she could never return to. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why did it have to end like this?" she whispered to the fire. "Why can't I just go home?" The flames flickered as if answering her sorrow. She hugged her knees close, resting her chin on them. "I just wanted to live peacefully," she said softly. "That's all." The wind grew louder. Snow blew in through the cracks in the wall. The fire began to die once more. Arya stared at it with tired eyes, unwilling to move. She had nothing left to burn. Then her gaze fell on the thin scarf wrapped around her neck. It was the last piece of warmth she had. For a long time she just stared at it, thinking. The memory of her mother tying it around her neck when she was little came rushing back. "To keep you warm, my light," her mother had said. That memory made her heart ache. She held the scarf tightly in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears falling silently. She placed it gently into the fire. The scarf caught quickly, and the flames rose higher again. The warmth spread over her face, but the pain in her heart was deeper than the cold ever could be. She sat there, watching it burn until nothing remained but ash. "You gave me warmth one last time," she said softly, her voice breaking. The fire glowed brightly for a few more minutes, then began to shrink once again. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Her breathing grew shallow. She curled up on the floor as close to the fire as she could get. She could hear the wind screaming outside, shaking the door, rattling the windows. The sound was wild, almost alive, but inside her, everything was quiet. She thought she saw something moving in the corner of the room, a shadow, tall and thin. Her tired mind wondered if it was her father, or maybe her mother, come to guide her. "Am I dying?" she whispered. The shadow didn't answer. It faded as quickly as it appeared. Maybe it was just her imagination. The fire flickered weakly. She closed her eyes, her thoughts slow and heavy. Her heart beat softly, like a fading drum. Yet even as darkness pulled her down, a small piece of her refused to let go. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow. I'll find something tomorrow." Outside, the snow fell endlessly. The storm had returned, louder and stronger. The cabin creaked and groaned, but it held together. Inside, the small flame fought bravely against the cold, and as Arya drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed, not of hunger, not of pain, but of sunlight. She saw herself standing in a green field, surrounded by flowers and warm air. She heard laughter again, felt her mother's hand in hers. For a few precious moments, she was not alone. The second night passed slowly, cruelly and yet somehow beautifully, because even in her weakest moment, Arya's heart still held that one small spark, the hope that tomorrow might bring light. The second morning came quietly. No birds sang. No sound of running water broke the stillness. The world was wrapped in white silence. Snow covered the broken roof of the cabin and piled high outside the door. When Arya opened her eyes, she felt like she was waking inside a frozen dream. Her body was weak. Every breath she took felt heavy, as if her lungs were filled with frost. The small fire she had made during the night was gone. Only black ashes and thin smoke remained. Her fingers were stiff, her lips dry and pale. She tried to move her hands, but they didn't respond right away. The hunger had grown worse. Her stomach felt like an empty hole. She pressed her hands against it, trying to stop the pain. "Just one more day," she whispered to herself. One more day. She looked around the small cabin. The walls were cracked, the roof was half broken, and the floor was covered with snow. The wooden furniture was gone, burned away to survive the second night. Only the cold and the silence remained. Arya tried to stand up, but her legs were weak. Her knees trembled and she almost fell. Still, she pushed herself up. She needed food. She needed something to burn. She couldn't survive another night like the last one. She wrapped her arms around herself and stepped outside. The air was sharp and painful. It cut against her skin like knives. The sky was gray, the color of ash. The trees were white with frost, their branches heavy and bending low. She walked slowly through the deep snow, leaving small footprints behind her. Every step took strength she didn't have. Her eyes searched the ground for anything she could eat, anything at all. But the forest was silent and empty. The animals were hiding. The berries were buried under thick snow. She tried to dig with her bare hands, but the ground was hard and frozen. Her fingers turned red and then pale again. She fell to her knees, breathing heavily. "Please," she whispered. "Just something, anything." But the forest gave her no answer. Only the wind moved, whispering through the trees like a ghost. Her thoughts drifted as she sat in the snow. She remembered a time long ago when winters were not so cruel. She remembered sitting by a warm fire with her family. Her father used to tell stories about heroes, kindness, and hope. Her mother used to hum soft songs as she cooked. The sound of her laughter had once filled their home. Arya smiled weakly at the memory. "You always said I was strong, Father," she murmured. "I'm trying to be." After a while, she forced herself to stand again. She couldn't stay outside too long. The cold was too strong today. It felt alive, as if it wanted to swallow her whole. She turned back toward the cabin, her vision blurry. Her head spun with dizziness. The walk back felt longer than before. Each step was a battle. When she finally reached the door, she almost fell inside. She closed it behind her and sat down, her breath shaking. Her skin burned from the cold and her body wouldn't stop shivering. She crawled to the fireplace and stared at the ashes. "I need fire again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't make it without it." But there was nothing left to burn. No furniture, no wood, no cloth. She looked around desperately. Then her eyes landed on her boots. They were old and half frozen, but they were made of thick leather. Maybe, just maybe, they could burn. Her hands hesitated. Those boots had walked many miles with her. They had been with her since she left her home. But now they were all she had left. With slow hands, she took them off. Her toes were pale and cold. She rubbed them quickly, trying to bring back warmth, but there was little to be found. She tore one of the boots apart and placed it near the ashes. She struck the stones together again and again until a spark caught. The fire began weakly, then slowly grew. The smell of burning leather filled the air, sharp and unpleasant, but the warmth returned to her face. She sighed in relief and sat close to it. The small fire lit up her face. The orange glow made her eyes shimmer. She looked at her bare feet, curled against the floor. They were already turning red from the cold. "Don't give up," she whispered to herself. Not tonight, but deep inside, fear crept in. This was the third night. She could feel it in the air. The cold was heavier, crueler. The forest outside was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped howling, as if waiting for something. As the hours passed, Arya tried to rest, but sleep would not come easily. Her body hurt too much. Her hands and feet burned, then went numb. She sat staring at the fire, lost in thought. Her mind drifted back to her childhood once more. She remembered when she was small, hiding behind her mother's dress during a summer festival. The humans had come to trade, to laugh, to dance. Back then her kind still lived among them. Her father had played music and the humans had smiled. She remembered the smell of bread baking, the sound of laughter in the air. For a moment she could almost feel that warmth again. Then she remembered the fire, the real one. The night when humans came not to dance but to destroy. Her home had burned, her people had run, and the friendship between their kinds had turned into fear. She had been young then, old enough to remember, too young to understand. "We were friends once," she whispered to herself. "What changed?" Her voice echoed softly in the empty cabin. The fire crackled, the only other sound. She stared into it, watching the flames dance. "Maybe," she said quietly. "They forgot we're not so different." The hours crawled by. The small fire was dying again. The boot was almost gone. Arya's eyes filled with tears. She looked around the room for anything else to burn. Her gaze landed on the corner, on her bag. Inside it was a small blanket, thin but precious. It was the last thing she had kept from her family. Her mother's blanket. She had carried it everywhere, using it as a reminder of home. Her fingers touched it gently. The fabric was soft, though old and worn. She held it to her chest and closed her eyes. "You always kept me warm," she whispered. "But now, I need you to do it one last time." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she placed the blanket into the fire. The flames grew bright and strong, reaching high. The light filled the small cabin, painting the walls gold and red. The warmth spread across her face, her hands, her feet. For a moment it felt like her mother's arms again. Gentle, safe, loving. Arya sat still, watching the fire burn. She could almost hear her mother's voice singing softly. "You're never alone, my little star," the memory said. Arya smiled weakly. "I remember," she whispered. "I still remember." The warmth made her eyes heavy. The exhaustion from hunger and cold pulled her toward sleep. But she fought it. She knew sleep could be dangerous. "Stay awake," she told herself. "Stay awake." She bit her lip, forcing her eyes open. Still, her mind wandered. The flames danced in front of her eyes, turning into shapes, faces she once knew. Her father. Her mother. The people of her village. They smiled at her through the light. "Come home, Arya," she thought she heard them say. "Come back to the light." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "I can't," she whispered. "Not yet." She reached a trembling hand toward the fire. "Just one more morning. Please let me see one more morning." The fire began to shrink again, slowly but surely. The blanket burned away, leaving only red coals and smoke. The warmth faded. The shadows grew longer. Arya wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the heat close, but it slipped away like sand between her fingers. Her teeth chattered. Her breath came out as mist. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine sunlight. She tried to picture a world without cold, without hunger, without fear. A world where people still believed in kindness. She imagined a hand reaching out to her, pulling her into warmth. A human hand, gentle and steady. Her heart slowed. Her body was weak. She felt herself drifting, like a leaf carried by the wind. But even as her strength faded, her spirit did not break. "Tomorrow," she whispered again, though her voice was barely a sound. "Tomorrow someone will come." Outside, the night deepened. The snow fell heavier, covering everything. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but its light still glowed faintly through the storm. Inside the cabin, the fire finally died, leaving only a faint red glow. Arya sat beside it, her eyes half closed. She was cold, hungry, and alone, but she was still alive. Somewhere deep inside her, a small spark still burned, a spark stronger than fire. Hope. And though she did not know it yet, far away in the forest, a light flickered, a human's lantern, moving slowly through the snow. The fourth morning was coming. The world was white, endless, empty, and cold. Arya woke with a slow, painful breath. Her eyelashes were frozen together, and a thin layer of snow covered her body like a blanket made by the sky itself. For a long time she did not move. Her body felt too heavy, too tired to fight anymore. She lay there, listening to the silence of the forest. No birds, no wind, only the faint sound of her own weak breathing. Her fingers could not bend. They were stiff, pale, and almost lifeless. She rubbed them together, but there was no warmth left in her. When she tried to move her legs, pain shot through her body. Her feet were numb, but the ache inside her bones told her she had to move or die right there. She looked around. The small camp she had built was gone. The fire pit was buried in snow, and the last piece of wood she had burned last night was now nothing but cold ash. The air smelled of frost and death. Her breath came out in soft clouds as she whispered, "It's morning." It was the fourth morning. The morning she had promised herself would never come unless help arrived. But no one had come. No footsteps, no light. No human voice. Just snow and silence. Still something inside her refused to give up. Even though her body screamed for rest, her heart whispered not yet. Slowly, painfully, she sat up. Her head spun and her vision blurred. She felt dizzy from hunger and exhaustion. She touched her chest. It rose and fell weakly, but it was still moving. That was enough reason to keep going. She wrapped the thin piece of fur she had left around her shoulders. It was torn and half burned, but it was all she had. She looked at the forest that stretched endlessly before her. Somewhere beyond it, she remembered, there had been a village. She had seen smoke from chimneys days ago before the storm became cruel. Maybe someone will help, she whispered, her voice shaking. She took one step, then another. Each step sank into deep snow. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she kept walking. The wind bit her cheeks and tore at her hair, but she didn't stop. The pain was the only thing that kept her aware she was still alive. Time passed slowly. The sun was hidden behind gray clouds, and everything looked the same. White trees, white ground, white sky. She couldn't tell how far she had gone. Every few minutes she stumbled and fell, her body trembling. But each time she fell, she forced herself to stand again. She whispered to herself, "One more step. Just one more." Hours passed. The forest began to thin, and in the distance she saw something, smoke. A thin trail of it rising into the sky. Her heart skipped. Smoke meant fire, fire meant life, and life meant people. Her weak lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. Someone is there. She began to move faster, but her body disagreed. Her legs wobbled and her knees gave out. She fell face first into the snow. The cold burned her skin, but she lifted her head. She could not stop now. She crawled, slowly, through the snow, one arm after another like a wounded animal fighting for its last breath. The smoke grew clearer as she got closer. Soon, she saw roofs covered in snow and small chimneys puffing gentle gray clouds into the morning air. A village. She had made it. Tears of relief filled her eyes, but they froze before falling. Arya tried to stand, but her body was too weak. She stumbled to her feet, swaying like a branch in the wind, and started walking toward the nearest house. Her vision blurred. She could barely see where she was going. When she reached the edge of the village, she heard voices. Human voices. For the first time in so long, the sound of people filled the air. Children laughing in the distance, a dog barking, someone chopping wood. Her heart raced. She had found them. But as she stepped into the open, the laughter stopped. The people turned and stared, their faces filled with confusion, then fear. "Look, it's one of them!" Someone shouted. "She's not human!" Another voice cried. Arya froze. She raised her trembling hands, trying to show she meant no harm. Her voice came out weak and broken. "Please, I just need warmth." Just for a moment. But no one came closer. Doors shut. Curtains drew. Parents pulled their children inside. Arya's hope began to fade as the whispers grew around her. "Don't let her near the fire. She'll bring bad luck. She's cursed." Her chest tightened. The kindness she had hoped for turned into walls. The cold outside was nothing compared to the cold in their eyes. She took a shaky step forward, trying to reach one of the houses, but the villagers backed away. Her vision blurred again. The world tilted. Then, just as her knees buckled, a voice broke through the silence. "Wait." It was deep, calm, and steady. A man stepped out from behind a wooden fence. He was tall, wrapped in thick winter clothes, with a kind but cautious look in his eyes. His face was weathered, but his gaze was gentle. He looked at Arya, not with fear but with concern. "She's freezing," he said. "We can't just leave her there." "Daniel!" one of the villagers shouted. "Don't bring her here. She's not one of us." Daniel ignored them. He walked toward Arya slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. She blinked, her body swaying as he got closer. She tried to speak again, but no words came out. When he reached her, he saw how pale she was, her lips almost blue, her body shaking uncontrollably. "You're freezing to death," he said softly. She tried to nod, but her knees gave out. He caught her before she hit the ground. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time in days she felt real warmth. Not from fire, but from another living soul. The villagers murmured in the background. Some watched with pity, others with suspicion. But Daniel didn't care. He lifted her in his arms. "I'm taking her inside." "Daniel, she's dangerous," an older man shouted. Daniel turned his head slightly. "So is winter. But we don't leave people to die in it." Without another word, he carried her toward his small wooden house at the end of the street. The villagers watched, whispering among themselves, but none stopped him. Inside, the warmth hit Arya like a wave. The smell of burning wood, the crackle of fire, it all felt unreal. He laid her gently on a blanket near the hearth. Her skin was icy cold and her breaths were shallow. Daniel moved quickly, placing more wood on the fire and covering her with thick furs. He boiled water and brought a cup to her lips. "Drink this," he said softly. Her trembling hands couldn't hold the cup, so he helped her, letting the warm liquid touch her lips. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why help me?" He looked at her, eyes filled with quiet sadness. "Because you needed help, and I couldn't walk away." She stared at him, trying to understand. Humans had always turned away from her kind. Yet here was one, risking the anger of his people for her sake. He smiled faintly. "Rest now. You're safe here." Arya closed her eyes, tears forming again. Not from pain this time, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The firelight danced on the walls as Daniel watched over her. Outside, the storm continued, snow falling softly against the window. But inside, warmth filled the room. For the first time in 3 nights, Arya slept without fear. Hours later, she stirred awake. The smell of soup drifted through the air. Daniel sat nearby, stirring a pot. When he saw her open her eyes, he smiled gently. "Feeling better?" he asked. Arya nodded weakly. "Yes, thank you." "You almost didn't make it," he said, his tone light but sincere. "You must have been out there for days." 3 nights, she whispered. 3 very long nights. He gave her a cup of warm broth. "Then it's time for you to rest through one peaceful night." Arya looked into the fire again. The flames reminded her of the ones she had built from her torn clothes, the desperate fires that had kept her alive. But this one was different. This one was steady, calm, shared. She looked at Daniel again, gratitude shining in her eyes. "You're the first human," she said softly, "who didn't turn away." Daniel smiled sadly. Maybe it's time that changed. The warmth of the fire grew stronger. Outside, the wind howled less fiercely, as if even the storm had softened. For the first time, Arya felt she might not be alone in the world anymore. Someone had seen her, not as a creature, not as a danger, but as a soul worth saving. And that, she thought, was enough reason to live. Morning came softly. Sunlight peeked through the small window of Daniel's cabin, spreading golden light across the wooden floor. The storm had finally stopped, and the world outside rested under a fresh blanket of snow. Inside, the air was warm and the fire still burned gently. Arya opened her eyes slowly. For the first time in days, she didn't wake up to the sound of howling wind or cracking ice. She woke to warmth, to the smell of cooked bread and to the quiet hum of life. Her body still ached, but it was a gentle ache, one that reminded her she was still alive. She turned her head and saw Daniel sitting near the table, pouring something into 2 cups. He noticed her awake and smiled. "Good morning," he said. Arya tried to smile back, though her lips were still dry and weak. "Morning." Daniel stood and brought her a cup of warm tea. "Careful. It's hot." She took it with trembling hands, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten. Comfort. She sipped slowly, closing her eyes for a moment as the heat reached her chest. "It's good," she said softly. Daniel chuckled lightly. "It's only herbs and honey." "Nothing special." She looked up at him. "After 3 nights of freezing, everything warm feels special." He nodded, his smile fading into a look of quiet understanding. "You've been through a lot." Arya didn't answer right away. She stared into the cup, watching the steam rise. "I didn't think I'd see another sunrise," she said at last. "When I burned the last of my clothes, I thought it was over." Daniel looked at her gently. "But you didn't give up." "I tried not to," she whispered. "Even when it hurt, something in me kept saying, 'Just one more night.'" He sat down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "You listened to that voice. That's what kept you alive." Arya smiled faintly. "Maybe, but if you hadn't let me in, I wouldn't be here now." Daniel looked at the fire, his eyes thoughtful. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest. The others, they don't understand yet. Arya's gaze dropped. "They were afraid. They always are," he said softly. "Fear makes people build walls even when they need bridges." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. The crackling fire filled the space with warmth and life. For the first time in years, Arya felt safe. She looked around the small cabin. It was simple. A wooden table, a few shelves, and a large fur rug near the fire. Yet it felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever known. After a few minutes, Daniel stood. "You should rest more. You're not strong yet." But Arya shook her head. "I want to help. I've been a burden long enough," he smiled. "You're not a burden. But if you really want to help, maybe start with breakfast." Her eyes widened slightly. "Breakfast?" He pointed to the pot on the fire. "I was going to make some soup. But 2 hands are better than 1. For the first time, Arya laughed, a quiet, gentle sound that filled the small cabin with something brighter than firelight. Hours passed peacefully. Arya moved slowly but insisted on helping. She stirred the soup, added herbs, and tasted it with a shy smile. Daniel taught her where he kept things, and she learned quickly. They ate together, talking in short, easy words. Daniel told her about the village, how winters were long, how people stayed close to survive. He had lived alone since his parents passed away, and though he was respected, he had always kept to himself. "And you?" he asked after a while. Where were you before the forest? Arya's eyes softened with memory. My people used to live near the river. We traded with humans once, long ago. But then fear came. We were different, and difference became danger. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. That shouldn't have happened. She smiled sadly. It did. I've been running ever since. He looked at her quietly for a moment, then said, You don't have to run anymore. Not here. Her heart ached at his words. They were simple, but they carried a kindness she hadn't felt in years. Later that day, Daniel stepped outside to fetch firewood. Arya watched him through the window, her eyes thoughtful. The village was still quiet. People stayed inside, but she could see shadows behind their curtains. Some watched her with curiosity, others with fear. She sighed. The world outside hadn't changed yet, but inside this small cabin something had. When Daniel returned, she was sitting near the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. They don't trust me, she said softly. He placed the wood near the hearth. They will. In time, Arya shook her head. I've seen fear last longer than winters. Daniel looked at her. Then maybe it's time someone showed them warmth lasts longer too. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no hesitation in his voice, only quiet strength. That evening, Daniel gave her his old cloak. It was thick and soft, much better than the half-burned fur she had been using. You'll need this if you go outside, he said. Arya touched the fabric gently. You've already given me enough, he smiled. It's just a cloak. No, she said softly. It's kindness. That's rarer. Daniel said nothing more, but his eyes told her he understood. Days passed. Arya grew stronger. Her color returned and her hands stopped trembling. Sometimes she helped Daniel chop wood or fetch water. Sometimes she simply sat by the window watching snowflakes drift past the glass. The villagers remained cautious. Some avoided Daniel's house entirely. Others whispered behind closed doors. But one morning, a small knock sounded at the door. It was a young girl, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. My mother said to give this, the girl said quickly. Not meeting Arya's eyes. Arya took it gently. Thank you. The girl nodded once and ran off into the snow. Arya turned to Daniel, smiling faintly. See, one small step, he grinned. Told you warmth lasts longer. Weeks went by. The snow began to melt, and the sound of dripping water replaced the howling wind. Arya sometimes helped Daniel deliver firewood to the villagers. Some still looked wary, but a few began to greet her with quiet nods. One evening, Daniel returned from the town meeting with a thoughtful look. They talked about you, he said. Arya's eyes widened. About me? He nodded. Some still fear you, but some say you saved the old forest trail from wolves. She smiled shyly. I only scared them away. They were just hungry. That's not how they see it. To them, you're someone who protected their children. Her smile faded into something deeper, grateful but uncertain. Do you think they'll ever truly accept me? Daniel leaned against the wall, his gaze gentle. I think they already started. Arya looked into the fire again. It burned steady and strong, just like it had on the first night she came here. Only now the fire wasn't a desperate light to keep her alive, it was a symbol of something new. Home. One night, as the stars shone clearly for the first time in months, Arya stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, but not cruel. She looked up at the sky and closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She heard Daniel's footsteps behind her. Cold? He asked. She smiled. Not anymore. He stood beside her, both of them watching the stars. The village lights glowed softly in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked and laughter came from one of the houses. It's strange, Arya said quietly. For so long I thought humans were only capable of fear. But you proved me wrong. Daniel looked at her. Maybe you just met the wrong ones first. She laughed softly. Maybe. The silence that followed was peaceful. After a moment, Daniel said, You could stay, you know. The village could use someone like you. I could too. Arya turned to him. Are you sure? He nodded. Completely. Her heart warmed. For the first time, she didn't feel like a traveler or an outcast. She felt seen. I'll stay, she said. If you'll have me, Daniel smiled. Then it settled. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the snow glisten under the moonlight. In the weeks that followed, things changed quietly but surely. The villagers began to greet Arya by name. Children waved when she passed. Old men shared stories by the fire, stories that included her courage. Spring came and flowers began to bloom around the edges of the melting snow. Life returned to the land and to her heart. Sometimes when Daniel left early for work, Arya would sit by the window, remembering that first night, the cold, the darkness, the pain. And she would whisper to herself with a small smile, it was all worth it. She had burned everything she had to survive. But in the end, she found something greater than warmth. She found kindness, and on the fourth night, when a human finally let her in, she didn't just survive, she began to live again.